motion, yeah, can be no make it work. I'm the boss, move something, yeah, this cool fucking suits me.
Solway, et bonum noctem, mihi nomen est Abe.
Hola, me llamo Frank. Anyway, today we're going to be adumbrating Unit 7b, Thinking, Problem Solving, Creativity, and Language in Meyer's Psychology for AP textbook.
Let's get started.
All right, Abe, take it away.
Let's do it. So we studied memory already. Now we're going to talk about how our brain uses all the information inside of it. Cognition is basically just thinking, but we can define it as all the mental activities associated with thinking, knowing, remembering, and communicating. Concepts, or mental groupings of similar things, help us simplify our lives. For example, a triangle is a concept. We can describe any three-sided shape as a triangle, and we don't need to come up with a separate word for every single variation of a three-sided shape. Prototypes are mental images that help us form concepts. For example, when I say bird, you probably think of a small creature with feathers. That's your prototype for the concept of a bird. Penguins are, by definition, birds, but since they don't have feathers and don't match the concept as closely, it takes longer for you to agree that a penguin is a bird. Fundamentally, concepts speed our thinking and guide our thinking. For example, our prototype prejudice usually involves males discriminating against females, and studies show that people tend to more easily detect male prejudice against females than vice versa.
So our brain deploys a few key strategies to assist with our problem-solving skills, which we could call brains and brawn. Brawn is embodied by algorithms, or a methodical procedure that guarantees solving a problem. On the other hand is brains, embodied by heuristics. Heuristics are simple thinking strategies that allow us to make fast judgments and solve problems quickly, but can be occasionally mistaken. So let's say Abe decides to go shopping for a new shirt at Macy's. He could walk through every single department and every single rack until he found the shirt he needed. And that would be using an algorithm, since eventually he would certainly find the shirt, but it would take a long time. On the other hand, he could walk straight to the men's department and then straight to the area where they had shirts on sale, and that would be using a heuristic, since it's quicker and simpler, but occasionally it could be wrong, since he might get lost. If you experience that neither a heuristic nor an algorithm helps you, you might experience a sudden flash of insight or a solution to a problem. I experienced insight just the other day when I was bored and realized I could be spending the time doing something much more constructive, like memorizing the presidents of the era of forgotten presidents. After learning about the brain's abilities to overcome problems, what are obstacles that we face?
Well, there are two things our brain tends to do which both hinder our problem-solving abilities. The first is confirmation bias, and that's when we seek evidence that affirms our ideas more readily than evidence that refutes our ideas. So if you form a thesis and sit down to write a research paper, you'll be much more receptive to sources that support your thesis rather than sources that disprove it. The second tendency inhibiting our problem-solving abilities is fixation, and that's when we fail to view a problem from a fresh perspective. Our first example of fixation is the mental set, which is our tendency to approach a problem in a manner that has been successful in the past.
Here's an example. Frank usually enters buildings by pushing doors open, so he'll continue to push on doors and expect them to open.
How do I get out?
Even though some doors only open by pulling.
Oh, stupid mental set.
The second example of fixation is functional fixedness, and that's our tendency to, quote, think of things only in terms of their usual functions. Functional fixedness explains why you may turn your house upside down searching for a screwdriver when a coin from your wallet would have turned the screw just as effectively. Here's a good example of someone evading functional fixedness by using a hammer as a paperweight. When we make decisions, we usually don't take the time to properly reason through them, and there are two heuristics connected to this. The representativeness heuristic is the tendency to judge likelihood based on how well certain things match our prototypes. And it's why if I asked you about a person who is slim, short, and enjoys poetry, you're more likely to tell me that that person is a professor of classics at an Ivy League university rather than a truck driver. However, when you do the math and you figure out that there are just so many more truck drivers in the world than there are Ivy League classics professors, you might realize that the odds of the person being a truck driver are actually much higher. There's another type of heuristic called the availability heuristic, and that operates when mentally available information overloads our judgments. The availability heuristic explains why we fear flying in airplanes or swimming in ocean waters more so than global climate change, even though climate change has the potential to be much more catastrophic. We can replay tapes of 9/11 in our head or replay scenes from the movie Jaws, but we don't have any readily available images of global climate change.
However, all of the strategies for problem solving we've been talking about do have a downside: overconfidence, which is characterized by overestimating the accuracy of our beliefs and judgments. Overall, overconfidence is pretty straightforward. I know I understand it completely, and I'm sure you do as well.
I do.
Moving on to belief perseverance, or the human quirk of clinging to our initial beliefs even after the evidence underpinning it has been discredited. Examples abound, from the hyper-religious who believe the earth is 6,000 years old, to Donald Trump, who says that climate change is Chinese propaganda, to Abe, who still thinks he's better at basketball than me.
Fact.
Belief perseverance also means that you ignore evidence that undermines your claim while magnifying and remembering evidence that supports your beliefs. Belief perseverance is a form of intuition, or effortless and automatic thought, the opposite of conscious reasoning. If I ask you what 24 plus 24 is, you automatically say 48. That's intuition. If I ask you what 24 times 24 is, you have to think a little while before getting to 576. So that's an example of conscious reasoning. It's important to remember that of the two, intuition is far more common and far quicker, but also far more prone to be wrong.
Let's move on to framing. Framing is sort of like looking at a glass half full or half empty.
Nah, my mom's gonna think I wet myself.
For example, let's say you announce that condoms have a 95% success rate. 9 out of 10 college students will rate a condom as effective. Then let's say you announce a condom as having a 5% failure rate. Only 4 out of 10 college students rate it as effective. We define language as any written, spoken, or signed words in addition to the techniques we use to combine them and communicate meaning. Now, there are 3 components that form a language. The first is phonemes. Phonemes are distinctive units of sound.
For example, with the word bat, there are 3 phonemes: b, a, t.
It is also important to note that consonants carry more information than vowels. Check out the example sentence in the book if you don't believe me. The second component of language are morphemes, which are distinctive units of meaning. Some morphemes are phonemes, such as I, and some are words, such as bat. Finally, under the umbrella of morphemes are also prefixes and suffixes, such as pre or ed.
In addition to phonemes and morphemes, all languages must have some form of grammar, or a set of rules that help us communicate with others. A form of grammar is semantics, which are simply the particular set of rules we use to organize morphemes, or words, into meaningful sentences. The sentence, "The air is obtuse," is grammatically correct, but meaningless. Syntax are more of what we think of when we think of what grammar Nazis care about. They're the rules we use to order words correctly. The syntax of English are what make us understand the sentence, "Abe ate 3 apples," but fail to understand 8 apples, Abe 3. It's also what distinguishes between English and Spanish in terms of adjectives. In English we say the fat cat, in Spanish they say gato gordo, or literally the cat fat. In terms of language acquisitions, humans learn in different stages. First, we enter the babbling stage, which Abe is still stuck in, arguably. Typically at 4 months of age. Babies try to emulate the sounds that their parents make. Examples are words like dada and mama. At around 1 year old, we enter the one-word stage, where you speak in very simple sentences. Look at the cat. Then follows the two-word speech at age 2, also known as telegraphic speech, where you begin to see simple combinations of nouns and verbs. The dog runs. Well, Abe, that's the run-through of language acquisition when you're really small. But what are the different theories for overall language learning?
Well, Frank, we have Skinner to thank for our first theory. He proposed the theory of operant learning, in which we learn by association, imitation, and reinforcement. Skinner basically believed that babies learn to talk in a similar manner to how a rat would learn to press a bar. We have Chomsky to thank for our second theory, and he viewed language development as helping a flower to grow in its own way. He basically believed that language will naturally occur through nurturing a child, since humans are born with a sort of switch box called a language acquisition device. Chomsky also proposed that a universal grammar underlies language, so all human languages contain the same grammatical foundation. Now, a third theory involves statistical analysis. The basic idea here is that infants have a remarkable ability to pick up on the statistical aspects of human speech. For example, when an 8-month-old infant listened to a monotone, unbroken string of nonsensical syllables, something like that, and so on, the infants began to recognize 3-syllable sequences that appeared repeatedly. All right, Frank, speaking of different languages, can knowing different languages affect the way we think?
Good question, Abe. The answer is yes. The way we think is inherently connected to the language we know. This concept, the concept that our language shapes the way we look at and interpret events, is known as linguistic determinism. In fact, experiments show that if a bilingual person takes a personality test in 2 different languages, they can score significantly differently because languages, for example, English and Chinese, differ significantly in how they represent various abstract ideas. This ability to change the way you perceive the world solely because of language demonstrates why it's such a good idea to learn a second language in the first place.
On a different note, we often think in images. If Frank is asked how to turn on the hot water in his bathroom, his first thought is probably an image of the hand grabbing the faucet handle for the hot water. Mental practice can also be very powerful, and it's standard for Olympic athletes. For example, if Frank spends some time imagining himself hitting a perfect tennis serve after he physically hits a bunch of serves, his serves will improve at a much faster rate. The bottom line of this section is that thinking affects our language, which then affects our thought. As Frank discussed, bilinguals have different senses of self when they speak different languages, so language influences thought. But thought must also influence language, since without thought, there wouldn't be any new words.
Fire phasers.
Okay. Frank's been very creative. But it's the end of our video on creativity.
Thank you for watching.
Please like and subscribe.
And comment down below if you have any questions.
Hey,
Catch you
records
guys
on my demo. Did y'all boys not get the memo?